She insulted an ordinary customer only to discover he owned the place and was Clint Eastwood. The midday sun poured through the large windows of Sierra Grill, a modest but bustling restaurant in Carmel by the Sea, California. It wasn't a high-end place, but it had its charm. A little rustic, a little modern. The kind of spot locals loved, especially on a warm Thursday afternoon. For Megan, a 23-year-old waitress trying to make ends meet, charm wasn't enough to soften her frustration. Her shift had been chaos since the moment she clocked in. "Table 7 needs extra dressing," called a fellow server. Megan didn't even glance up as she scribbled the latest order onto her notepad. Her ponytail swayed as she rushed between tables, juggling complaints about undercooked steaks, split checks, and forgotten drink orders. To top it all off, she'd dealt with 3 rude customers in the past hour, each leaving her with nothing but a few coins as a tip. By the time a man in his 80s strolled in and quietly took a seat at a corner table, Megan was already on edge. He looked like someone who didn't care much for appearances, slightly wrinkled flannel shirt, faded jeans, and a well-worn Stetson resting on the table. His boots looked like they'd seen decades of dirt roads. Megan gave him a quick once-over, her lips curling into a faint smirk. "Great," she muttered under her breath. "Another one who's probably going to order a coffee and leave me $1. But she couldn't avoid him forever. Her coworker nudged her, whispering, "You've got table 12. Megan sighed and grabbed her notepad, pasting on her practiced smile as she approached. "What can I get you today?" she asked, her tone teetering on impatience. The man looked up, his sharp eyes scanning her face for a moment. There was something strikingly familiar about him, but Megan couldn't quite place it. "Just a burger," he said calmly. His voice was low and gravelly, carrying a weight that seemed to command respect. "Burger. Got it. Anything else?" Megan asked, her pen tapping against the notepad. "No, ma'am," he replied, tipping his hat slightly. She rolled her eyes as she walked back to the kitchen, muttering, "Ma'am? Really?" under her breath. But as she entered the kitchen, she couldn't shake the feeling that something about him stood out. He wasn't like the other customers, rude, demanding, or dismissive. There was a quiet confidence about him, almost as if he was watching and waiting for something. Megan shrugged it off. It was just another table, another order, another $1. But she had no idea just how wrong she was. Megan returned to table 12 with the man's burger after a few minutes. The plate clattered onto the table with less care than she usually gave. She was running on fumes, her smile more forced than ever. The man didn't seem to notice, or if he did, he didn't let it show. "Here you go," Megan said, brushing a strand of hair from her face as she placed the ketchup bottle next to his plate. "Anything else?" The man glanced at the burger, then back at her. "No, this looks just fine. Thank you." His words were polite, but there was a firmness in his tone that made Megan feel oddly self-conscious. She lingered for a moment, unsure why she hadn't already moved on to the next table. Something about his demeanor annoyed her. Maybe it was the calmness, the unshakable composure. Everyone else in the restaurant was either complaining, snapping their fingers, or rushing around in a frenzy. But not him. "You're not from around here, are you?" she asked abruptly, leaning on the edge of the table. She couldn't help herself. "No, I'm not," he replied simply, cutting his burger in half with deliberate precision. "Thought so," she said, smirking again. "The hat gave it away. Looks like you just stepped out of an old Western movie." For the first time, the man smiled. It wasn't a full grin, just a faint curve of his lips. "Something like that," he said. Megan expected him to get defensive or annoyed, but he didn't. That only frustrated her more. She was tired of being polite, tired of holding back her thoughts. "You know," she said, lowering her voice as if sharing a secret, "most people around here don't show up looking like they just came from a ranch." He didn't respond immediately, taking a measured bite of his burger instead. Then, after a moment, he said, "I guess I'm not most people." The words were simple, but they carried a weight Megan didn't expect. She felt a flicker of embarrassment, but quickly buried it. "Well, enjoy your meal," she said, pushing herself off the table and walking away before he could say anything else. She was sure she'd gotten the last word. But as she cleared another table nearby, she noticed him watching her, not in a creepy way, but with an expression that made her feel like she was being evaluated, judged even. It was unsettling, and she couldn't figure out why it bothered her so much. But something about that look would soon change the course of her day and her life, in ways she never saw coming. The lunch rush began to wind down, and the restaurant grew quieter. Megan finally had a chance to catch her breath. She leaned against the counter, scrolling through her phone while keeping an eye on her tables. Her gaze flicked to table 12, where the man was finishing his meal. He seemed in no hurry, sipping his water and glancing around the restaurant with quiet curiosity. "Hey, Megan," her coworker Danny said as she walked by. "Isn't it weird how calm that guy is? Like, he's just taking it all in." Megan shrugged. "Yeah, well, some people have all the time in the world." Danny chuckled. "Maybe he's famous or something. He looks familiar, doesn't he?" Megan rolled her eyes. "Famous? Yeah, right. If he's famous, then I'm the Queen of England." Danny raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. Megan wasn't in the mood for idle speculation. Instead, she grabbed the check for table 12 and walked over, determined to keep the interaction brief. "Here's your check," she said, placing it on the table with a faint smile. "Whenever you're ready." The man glanced at the check but didn't reach for it immediately. Instead, he looked up at her, his sharp eyes locking onto hers. "Do you enjoy your job?" he asked, his voice calm but deliberate. The question caught Megan off guard. She hesitated, her practiced smile faltering. "It's fine," she said with a shrug. "It's a job, you know?" He nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "A job's what you make of it," he said after a moment. "But it seems like you're carrying a lot today." Megan felt her cheeks flush. Who was he to comment on her attitude? She crossed her arms defensively. "Look, I've had a rough shift, okay? Not everyone gets to sit around eating burgers and handing out life advice." To her surprise, the man didn't seem offended. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, a faint smile playing at his lips. "Fair enough," he said. "But sometimes how you treat people in those moments says more about you than you think." Megan felt a flicker of anger rise in her chest. Was he lecturing her? She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, he stood up and reached into his pocket for his wallet. "I'll leave you with that thought," he said, placing a few bills on the table. "Thanks for the meal." As he walked toward the door, Megan muttered under her breath, "Yeah, whatever, cowboy." But just as he reached the exit, something strange happened. The manager, a no-nonsense woman named Carol, hurried out from the back office. Her face lit up when she saw the man, and she extended her hand enthusiastically. "Mr. Eastwood, I wasn't expecting you today," Carol said, her voice filled with respect. Megan froze. Her stomach dropped as she replayed the name in her head. Eastwood. Clint Eastwood. She whipped her head toward the door, her eyes widening as she saw him turn back briefly to shake Carol's hand. His eyes caught hers for just a moment, a knowing look passing between them before he walked out the door. And in that moment, Megan realized she hadn't just insulted an unassuming customer, she'd insulted the owner of the restaurant. Megan stood frozen in place, her notepad clutched tightly in her hand. She stared at the door Clint Eastwood had just walked through, her mind racing. Did she really just brush off Clint Eastwood? The Clint Eastwood? And not just that, he was the owner of the restaurant? Her heart started pounding as Carol turned toward her. "Megan," she called, waving her over, "can you believe it? Mr. Eastwood stopped by today. He's been so busy lately I haven't seen him in weeks." Yeah, that's..." "Wow," Megan stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Carol didn't seem to notice Megan's discomfort. She was too busy gushing. "You know, this place means the world to him. He's so hands-on. Every detail here is something he's personally approved. That's why we're always reminding staff to bring their best. You never know when he'll stop by." Megan felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. She replayed every word she'd said to him, every snarky comment, every eye roll. Her cheeks burned with humiliation. "Are you okay?" Danny asked, noticing Megan's pale face. I think I need a minute," Megan muttered, retreating to the break room. As soon as the door closed behind her, she let out a shaky breath and sank into a chair. How could she have been so oblivious? She'd been working at the Sierra Grill for 2 years, and in all that time, she'd never bothered to pay attention to the stories about the mysterious owner. If she had, maybe she'd have recognized him, or at least thought twice before running her mouth. Her mind was spinning, but one thought stood out. What now? But Megan had no idea that Clint wasn't done with her just yet. The next day, Megan arrived at work with a knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. She hadn't slept well, replaying the events of the previous day in her mind. Every time she thought about Clint Eastwood's calm demeanor and the look he gave her as he left, she cringed. What if he told Carol about her attitude? What if she got fired? She couldn't afford to lose this job, not with rent due in 2 weeks and her student loans piling up. She spent the first half of her shift avoiding eye contact with Carol and doing everything she could to keep her customers happy. Smiling, apologizing, refilling drinks before anyone even had to ask. It was the most effort she'd put into her job in months. By the time lunch rolled around, the restaurant was humming with activity. Megan was wiping down a table when she heard the unmistakable gravelly voice she hadn't been able to forget. "Well, looks like you're busy today." She turned sharply to see Clint Eastwood standing near the counter, his hands resting casually in his pockets. He was dressed much the same as the day before, but this time his presence felt even more commanding. Her heart sank. She forced a nervous smile, trying to think of what to say. Mr. Eastwood. Hi, I didn't know you'd be back so soon." He tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "I like to check in on my places from time to time. Keeps everyone on their toes." Megan swallowed hard, her palms sweaty. "Right. Well, everything's running great today." He gave a small nod, then glanced around the restaurant. "I see that. But you seem a little tense." She froze. Of course he noticed. He probably noticed everything. About yesterday." He held up a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "No need to apologize," he said calmly. "I'm not here to make your life harder." She blinked, caught off guard by his response. "You're not?" "No," he said, his voice steady. "But I do think there's a lesson here. You never know who you're talking to, or what they might be going through. A little kindness goes a long way." Megan's throat tightened. She didn't know how to respond, so she just nodded, feeling a lump form in her chest. "Look, I've had bad days too," Clint continued, his tone softening. "But the way you handle those days says a lot about who you are. And trust me, people notice." She could feel her face turning red. His words weren't harsh, but they hit harder than any scolding ever could. He wasn't trying to embarrass her. He was trying to teach her something. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I mean it." He gave her a small smile. "You're welcome. Just remember, every interaction's an opportunity. Use it well." With that, he tipped his hat and walked out, leaving Megan standing there, overwhelmed with a mix of emotions. And for the first time in a long time, she felt a spark of something she hadn't expected. The desire to be better. Over the next few weeks, Megan couldn't shake Clint's words. They replayed in her mind every time she stepped onto the restaurant floor. Every interaction's an opportunity. Use it well. At first, she didn't know how to start making changes. She wasn't the type to flash fake smiles or gush over customers like some of her coworkers did. But Clint's calm demeanor and quiet wisdom had struck a chord. She didn't have to pretend to be someone she wasn't. She just needed to show a little more patience, a little more care. So she started small. When a frazzled mom with 3 kids spilled a soda across the table, Megan didn't sigh or roll her eyes. Instead, she grabbed a rag, smiled, and said, "Don't worry, it happens to the best of us." When an elderly couple asked her to repeat the specials 3 times, she didn't let her frustration show. She patiently explained them again, even adding her own recommendations. And the thing that surprised her most? The more effort she put into treating people kindly, the better she felt. One evening, near the end of her shift, Carol called Megan into the office. Megan's stomach twisted with nerves as she stepped inside, fearing the worst. "You've been working here for a while. Carol began, folding her hands on the desk. "And I've noticed a change in you lately. A good one." Megan blinked, unsure how to respond. "Oh, thank you. I don't know what brought it on," Carol continued, "but whatever you're doing, keep it up. The customers have noticed too. One of them even left a comment card the other day praising your service." Megan felt her chest swell with a mix of pride and disbelief. She hadn't expected anyone to notice her efforts, let alone acknowledge them. As she left the office, a smile tugged at her lips. She still had a long way to go, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was on the right path. That night, as she locked up the restaurant, she glanced at the sign out front. It wasn't just a job anymore. It was a place where she could grow, learn, and maybe even make a difference. And she owed it all to the quiet cowboy who'd walked in one busy afternoon and taught her a lesson she'd never forget. Because sometimes, the smallest interactions have the biggest impact, and every moment is a chance to become someone better. If this story inspired you, hit the like button and share it with someone who could use a little encouragement. And don't forget to subscribe for more real-life lessons and stories that remind us all to be a little kinder every day.